Hello again, it's Jo Seaman here, Heritage Manager for Eastbourne Borough Council, with our latest Heritage at Home talk. And today I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite subjects, which is about historic graffiti. Now, I should warn you that usually when I do a talk on this subject, I go on for well over an hour, and I've been told there is no way I can possibly do that on one of these broadcasts. So I'm going to try and keep it within 20 minutes. So this is just a taster session of the wonderful world of historic graffiti, with paying particular attention to the graffiti recording and study that we've been doing of St Mary's Church in Eastbourne. So let's start at the beginning. What is graffiti? Well, the Oxford English Dictionary describes it as writing or drawings that have been scribbled, scratched or painted illicitly on a wall or other surface, often within public view. Now, obviously that leaves us with a massive scope of things that we could class as graffiti. The two examples on the screen there are both graffiti, I think, would agree. On the right is actually a piece of rather lovely graffiti, I think, from Bayeux. I took that in Normandy last year, just outside the museum, in fact. And there we have a Norman knight spray painting one of the scenes from the Bayeux Tapestry on a wall. And on the left is a piece of graffiti also from last year. This probably without as much artistic merit, and was actually sprayed on a scheduled ancient monument of the Redoubt Fortress. That cost rather a lot of money to get removed. But both pieces, I think we'll agree, are graffiti. But the term that we're using for graffiti covers so many other different expressions, if you like, many of which we would consider are artistic or perhaps even are historic documents. So what we'll be doing in the next 20 minutes or so is just examining those and looking at the different forms that graffiti can take mainly in our churches today, but also more specifically at the graffiti in St Mary's Church in Eastbourne. Now, this slide shows just some of the graffiti that we've recorded in the church. Now, we've been recording the graffiti and other marks in the church for a couple of years now. I think we've probably got about 300-400 pieces, individual pieces of graffiti, probably more. We've mostly recorded the church now. We do still have to record the tower properly. But as you can see, that simplified diagram there just shows some of the varieties and the locations of the graffiti. And you can see it's not just in the more public part of the church. If you imagine in medieval Eastbourne, you would not, if you're a sort of an average person, not a member of the clergy, you would not be allowed to pass into the area of the chancel or the chancel aisles, even with the side chapels in there. Our public area would be the nave. So you'd expect there to be graffiti in the nave, I suppose, but actually the majority of the graffiti we have at St Mary's is in the chancel area, and that includes script, fish, all sorts of things. And that, if it is medieval, and we can prove some of it is, must have been carried out either by the clergy or with the sort of under the auspices of the clergy, with their authority. So it's very interesting. St Mary's is unusual for graffiti in Sussex in that it is more the sort of graffiti we have, and the spread of it is much more like one of the great churches, one of the sort of cathedrals. But in many ways, St Mary's is like a mini cathedral. But that is a subject of another talk entirely, I think. But it's a big, grand parish church, probably much too big for the parish, and that's because of who built it. So one form of graffiti that we get in churches, buildings, everywhere is what I term the I was here, tagging, leaving your mark, leaving a name. And this can take many, many, many different forms. This piece here I like to show because people's initial reaction is always really interesting. Often it's, oh, look at that. And yes, all right, you could say that me, Latham, 87, was that Jason, 07. They're not particularly beautifully rendered pieces of script, but look closer and you'll start seeing in there, amongst the 20th and 21st century graffiti. There's also some early 20th century graffiti there. There's quite a lot which dates from the Second World War. This is actually from one of Dover Castle's caponniers, one of their sort of semi-subterranean tunnel areas. And a lot of the graffiti here relates to soldiers who were stationed here. So it is part of a historic document. And it's one of those decisions to make, is that what is actually vandalism and what is part of our history? I'd say all of that is part of our history. Obviously, we don't want people necessarily to carry on doing it, but that is still a record of people who are there. I love seeing that. I like to try and imagine who these people were, what they've gone on to do, what their lives were like. And it could be the starting point to a really exciting journey of investigation and exploration. But there's also graffiti. JS is nothing to do with me. This piece is from Bateman's mill and records the restoration of the mill in 1795. Still tagging, still graffiti, but people tend to look at that in a slightly different light. And again, this speaks for itself, doesn't it? Blackadder was here. I love this piece of graffiti. I know it's not old. I know it's vandalism, but it's now part of the historic fabric of that building. Now, I think that's funny because of what it alludes to. My children, though, wouldn't have a clue who Blackadder was. It just makes me feel very, very old indeed. But again, it does show this question of what is vandalism, what is part of the historic record, when is that cut-off point? And I don't have the answers for that, I'm afraid. Now, St Mary's has its fair share of tagging. Not in the main body of the church. Unusually, we don't have a lot of post-Reformation or post-medieval tagging, which you do get in other churches, particularly cathedrals, actually. Initials, sometimes dates if you're lucky. But what we do have in the church tower is a lot of tagging, names, dates from, we suspect, vergers, but also the campanologists, the bell ringers going up there. It's sort of an accepted thing in belfries to do a bit of graffiti. And again, it's one of those things, isn't it? Is it actually vandalism there, or is it a way of just recording they were there? I was here, I was doing it, I was a bell ringer, I've left my mark. And the bottom right there is really interesting. That's actually in the clock case of the church in the church tower, and it dates from the 1940s and 50s. And it's a wonderful record there. One person's war, really, recording some massive historic events such as the death of Hitler and the bombing of Hiroshima, but also some quite personal events as well that give us an insight not only into the times they were being written down, but also into someone's mind, into what was important to this person and why he recorded it there. Wonderful, wonderful thing. Commemoration is another reason to use graffiti. Here we have William Dodd and Rebecca Dodd with the 1799 date and the heart, which I think is associated with it. Could be later. Really lovely thing, and it's a piece which is quite large in the tower in the ground floor of the tower of St Mary's, and it's a piece that many of the church wardens and vergers hadn't seen before until I showed it to them, because they just hadn't taken a torch and used that raking light against the wall, because why would they? We haven't actually found who William and Rebecca are. There are Dodds in Eastbourne at that time, but I think this relates to probably the restoration of that part of the tower. I think that a balcony was being taken out at that stage. There were certainly building works going on then. And we have a number of other tags of that date in there. Another thing we should say about commemoration is that how else would you necessarily record you being there? You can't just write it on a piece of paper and stick it on the wall. This is a way of indelibly leaving your mark. Certainly now I sit and wonder who they are. We'll find out maybe one day. And in St Mary's itself, there is other script there. I mean, this is just an example. I won't go through them all, but it goes from probably merchants' marks or some religious guild there with the A's. We're not sure yet. The J Dunn and JM, almost certainly Mr Dodd's friends, part of that 1799 restoration. The JM we think we've identified. The shield, again, that has identifiable heraldry. The script itself is from the chancel. The one which is unfortunately rather blurred because I tried to blow it up a bit too much. This is quite a well-known piece in the church. And it looks like it says Philippa or Philip, and it's actually, we believe, Philippus. It's medieval script, and it, in that form, would be invoking or asking St. Philip to intercede on your behalf. It's quite a strange saint to actually ask to intercede. He was known as the saint, I believe, of hatters and pastry chefs. It's not a particularly well-known saint, although he's one of the apostles. So maybe it is that someone was born on his saint's day, which was actually May the 1st. And maybe, therefore, it had a very personal meaning. A personal saint, if you like, to call on in times of need. This is a bit more controversial, is the protective function, if you like, to graffiti. And really, I feel it relates more to the secular buildings of the post-medieval period, the 17th century and 18th century, where we do find a lot of symbols carved in walls, on fireplaces, burn marks, which seem to relate to magical house protection. We do get these symbols in churches too, but I think they probably have a slightly different function. Protection in a church. Would you need protection, spiritual protection in a church? Possibly. If something has happened to that church, something bad has happened, either it's been damaged or a terrible event has taken place in it or in the community, it is possible you might think that church needs extra protection. But the church itself is protected. The cross itself is probably the most powerful protective mark you can find. So do you need these other ones? Maybe on a personal level. The pentagram there on the right, the 5-pointed star, people often think that as being a symbol of witchcraft or devil worship. It's actually a Christian symbol. Gawain was known from Gawain and the Green Knight of having it on his shield. Obviously, it's a fantasy story, but it's a medieval story. And the star represented the 5 wounds of Christ. And that piece of graffiti isn't from Eastbourne. I mean, that is actually supposedly the star being actually put over the image of a demon to seal it in, perhaps. Don't know. But this one of protection, I think, although the symbols turn up, I'm not so sure how protected the church needed to be. Maybe it's personal protection. That could well be what people are thinking about. We do have a little bit of protective graffiti, or what would be classed protective graffiti, as say I have a few issues with that, which is this VV symbol. It's a W, if you like. Now, some people think it represents the Virgo Virginum, the Virgin of Virgins. And actually, in a church dedicated to St Mary the Virgin, you would expect to see lots of those symbols if that's what it meant. However, we've got three individual pieces of this VV in the church, and these two aren't particularly large or well rendered. There is a slightly better one. Now, if it's a protective symbol, do you need it in a church? Is there some other reason for doing it? Does it actually not mean Virgin of Virgins at all? I'm tending to think that way. I'm tending to think this symbol, which is one of the most common that you find in secular buildings, certainly, but also in churches, often carved on tomb effigies, mostly, I believe, from the post-medieval period. I think it might have a slightly different meaning, or it could be one of these symbols that has meant a number of different things. What's interesting with these examples from St Mary's is that one of them, the smaller one this has just been covered over by, is actually found here in one of the most sacred parts of the church, the East End, and actually in the Easter Sepulchre. Would that need protecting? Let's see. I'm not sure. There are other ways as well of recording, making a mark in churches. And some of these are very touching. The top one there is someone actually asking for God to have mercy upon a soul of an individual. That's quite explicit. The bottom one is really touching. It's, I believe, a memorial to these three sisters, Catherine, Jane and Amy Madingley, in 1515. Now we know that those three people, this I should say isn't from Eastbourne, all died of plague in 1515, three sisters. And it's very likely that many people who couldn't afford a permanent memorial would maybe sometimes have a wooden memorial, sometimes nothing at all. So maybe by carving their names on the wall of a church, you're actually memorialising their names, their memories more permanently. And that is certainly some way, that's one of the ways that a lot of people see names recorded in churches aren't necessarily as the eye was ear type thing, but are as a form of informal memorial. It certainly seems that it is accepted. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a perfectly good idea. Now, as I said, we don't have so many initials and names in Eastbourne, but what we do have here are two of at least three examples of a piece of graffiti which represents a bow and arrow. Now, there could be many reasons for that, but the main reason that we see the symbol of the bow and arrow is for St. Sebastian. And St. Sebastian was the saint that you would go to in times of plague. Now, it could be then that what we have here are people's drawings, their prayers etched in stone at a time of terrible, terrible calamity. The time where your population of your small town, village is halved, or even 2/3 of them are dying of this plague. And at those times, you may well go to a saint who would intercede on your behalf with God. In this case, St. Sebastian, who is known as one of the saints to go to in times of plague, as I say. And these weren't found in the nave, these were in the chancel. So if these are medieval, then they have to be carved by the clergy, or certainly under the auspices of the clergy again. This isn't necessarily graffiti that is illicit. This is maybe the clergy are complicit in it and actually endorsing it. Certainly for me, this one, it makes a tingle go up my spine when I actually think that this could be evidence, tangible evidence of that terrible time. But people survived though. People got through it. And I think that gives me hope as well. This is a lovely piece of graffiti where we can see there are connections across counties. These are Christograms, XPS, IHC, ways of writing Jesus's name down using Latin and Greek lettering. And the one on the left is from St Mary's in Eastbourne. The ones on the right, the two examples there, are from Chichester Cathedral. Now they look to be a very similar hand. The flourish on the X is unusual. The way that the lettering is different on each part but seems to go together. It looks very much like this is either the same hand or done at a very similar time. For stylistic reasons, it has to be that way. And the really exciting thing is, not only have we found this in Eastbourne and Chichester, we've recently found examples at Faversham in Kent and even in Canterbury Cathedral. Not just Canterbury Cathedral, but in the crypt around the original site of St Thomas's tomb. So it could be that what we have here is a great example of someone being allowed to leave their mark in churches, possibly as they go on the old pilgrimage route from Winchester up to Canterbury. We're still working on this, but it's a very exciting piece that which we discovered very recently. Now, a piece that I won't talk about for long because we have no examples in St Mary's at all are the marks of a professional, the merchant marks and the mason's marks. You do find these in churches, but as I say, in fact, other churches in the area, I believe West Ham and Pevensey do have them, but we don't have any that we've discovered so far in St Mary's. One of the most enigmatic symbols we find in St Mary's Church and in many churches and indeed in secular buildings is this, the compass drawn mark, or hexafoil, or daisy wheel. I could do a whole talk just on these. These are wonderful pieces of art. It's very hard to do with a compass, to scratch this onto a curved surface, particularly a hard surface like Karnstein. We don't know the true meaning behind these. There are many theories out there. Certainly this symbol has been around since about 800 BC at least. We've seen it on Carthaginian tombstones. It appears right throughout history and is still being used today on churches, particularly in Eastern Europe. The symbol itself has many meanings to many different people. We are actually currently working on a number of ideas with this. One of the ideas at the moment is it simply represents the cross. You often find them on fonts in a sort of decorative motif. Others that it represents the key row type cross. Others that it is a sun symbol, and the sun and Jesus are connected. So we just don't know. But look out for this one. It's a wonderful one, and St Mary's has some great examples. And then we have our fish and ships. Wonderful. I'm running out of time now, but again, these are so important to St Mary's and make it so different. Not necessarily the ships, but the fish are. The ships are quite common in graffiti terms. We've got medieval examples of ships because of the shape of them, and this is a beautiful late 18th, early 19th century ship. Ships could be recorded for many reasons. I think sometimes it's to ask for good luck, ask for sort of. Sometimes they're almost could be carved, certainly in later times, as a thank you for a successful voyage, or just because people are representing what they're seeing around themselves. It's so many different reasons. And the ships here, we even have a fish which has been changed into a ship. And again, reasons for this, well, you can take your pick. And again, a more detailed version of that rather beautiful late 18th or early 19th century ship. And there is actually a screen in the church. It's very hard to see them, but there's probably about 30 to 40 different vessels, and you can start making out fishing boats and various other sorts on there, and that is a study in itself. That's all in St Mary's. It's incredible. So here we have again one of our fish. This is one of my favourite fish. Now I say one of my favourite fish, that's because in St Mary's we have over 60 representations of fish. Now, are they fish or are they dolphins? They look very similar to the medieval representation of dolphins, and dolphins were used in Christian iconography for salvation and resurrection. So are they actually dolphins? They are not just scattered all over the place. They are only in the chancel. The ones on the chancel piers or columns do seem to be decorative in the way they've been designed, in that each alternate column has either vertical or horizontal fish. They are different. They're not all this well detailed. Some of them are pretty much just like a lozenge shape. There is going to be a deeper meaning behind why these fish, were carved in the first place. And we are working on that at the moment. You can also see in this detailed picture there that it has got traces of paint on the column as well. And what we're trying to work out here is whether the actual carving has carved through the paint or whether the paint has been painted over. At the moment, I'm afraid to say the jury is out a bit because it looks a bit like both. But only by looking at this in forensic detail will we begin to understand it. But the good news is that we can give a date for at least some of these fish. And that's because on these columns that you can see have been divided up by that sedilia, there are fish. And the sedilia itself we know is put in around 1350 to 1380. And that sedilia actually, as you can see here, cuts one of the fish on the columns. So you can say that fish certainly predates the sedilia, which is mid to late 14th century. The fact that the fish are only in the chancel itself as well would indicate a medieval date as well. And here we are, just a quick representation there of the fish in the chancel arches on the south side. There are loads of them. Now, this is unprecedented. Fish appear in graffiti all around the country, but not in this form or in this quantity. This is completely unique as far as we can tell, and we are continuing our study, but it just goes to show how important St Mary's is in terms of our study of graffiti as we go forward. The graffiti and the studies we're doing are helping us re-evaluate the date of the church itself, when it was first built, what areas, when it was restored. It gives us a better understanding of how the church worked, what's going on in there in the medieval period. It gives us a new view on how St Mary's was established and developed over time. And it gives us this evidence of the changes and alterations inside, and helps us get this chronological dates for some of the graffiti, which is very, very rare. And hopefully it's connecting people from the past. It gives us an idea that they are everyday people with hopes and dreams and emotions, not just these sort of vague images. And part of this study is helping us to rewrite the history books in relation to the development of Eastbourne as a medieval town. That, I'm afraid, will have to wait for another day. I hope you've enjoyed that. It's gone on a bit longer than I anticipated, but there is so much to say about our study of medieval graffiti, and as well as it being great fun and a really interesting thing to do, it does somehow give us this connection to people. Actually, to be recording a piece of graffiti that was made by another person's hand hundreds of years ago, to stand in that same position, it's quite a moving and emotional experience. So if you want to get involved, like I say after each of these, please contact us. The website is up there, Facebook, the Sussex Historic Graffiti Project has a page. Do contact us. Let's keep talking. Stay safe, stay well, and I'll speak to you again soon.